Jordan Peterson, thank you so much for joining me. This Alliance for Responsible Citizenship, great speakers, sold out. Your idea, what did you want it to achieve?
Well, I would like it to achieve a new motivation for people, I suppose. It's not precisely a political conference. I would characterize it as a motivational conference, and that makes sense with regard to my involvement because I'm a psychologist and not a politician. And my sense of the world is that we are allowing ourselves to lose faith and courage and to accept an apocalyptic and limited view of the future and all of the tyrannical restrictions that are likely to accompany that because we're afraid. And I can understand why people are afraid. There's always reason to be afraid of the future because we're vulnerable and terrible things can happen to each of us and will and to our societies. But I think that courage and faith, wide-eye open courage and faith when confronting the future is the most appropriate stance. And I also think that the future is much more likely to be the sort of place you'd like to inhabit if you develop a positive vision of what that future could be and then work diligently to accomplish that in some ways regardless of the evidence, right? And that would be the faith component, is that you're called upon as a moral agent to act as if the future can be brought about in a positive way, all evidence to the contrary. And so that's part of the message that we're hoping to communicate at this conference.
Well, just to introduce the conference, you and another speaker, Bjorn Lomborg, who's been a regular guest here too, you co-wrote an op-ed saying among this catastrophizing you just talked about, well, look, even now that we've got two wars going now in the Middle East as well as Ukraine, in fact, the death rate from war last year was not much more than a tenth of the rate of deaths by war last century. Deaths from climate disasters, only a tiny fraction of what it was 50, 60, 70, 80 years ago. We're richer. So why do you think there is this catastrophizing now?
Well, I think it's partly a consequence of our lack of genuine historical knowledge, and that's something that Bjorn has been very good at making public because he's very careful with his statistical models and his description of the actual past as opposed to the hypothetical past. And then I think that it's easier for bad news to sell, and in a marketplace where legacy media sources in particular, and perhaps everyone else, are desperate for clicks, it's easier to attract people's attention to the negative than it is to attract their attention to the positive. It's also easy if you're no longer naive and you say move from naive to cynical, which is a step towards wisdom, to assume that a clear-headed person would take a dire view of the future with all the terrible things that might make themselves manifest. But I think there's a step past that bitter cynicism to a courageous optimism, and I don't think that that story has been told very well. I don't think that political leaders have been able to develop, regardless of their position on the political spectrum, have been able to develop anything approximating a positive vision that people find compelling and attractive. And I guess the other thing that we're trying to offer to people as a potential positive vision is the notion that if each person took responsibility for their lives, we haven't had serious discussion of responsibility in our culture for about 6 decades. If each person took the requisite responsibility that could be part and parcel of their lives, they would find something useful and interesting and adventurous and compelling to do, and they wouldn't put themselves in a position where they were likely to fall sway to the blandishments of utopian centralizing globalists. And so part of the vision of ARC2 is a vision of subsidiarity, and that's an ancient concept. It's really the basis for a sophisticated conservatism, and it's predicated on the notion that true identity is to be found in the adoption of a hierarchical social mode of being. So you take responsibility for yourself, and if you can do that, then you take responsibility for your intimate partner, your wife or your husband, and if you can manage that together, well, which will keep you occupied in the attempt, then you could perhaps dare to raise a family, and maybe you could organize that properly, and that would also give you something to do. And then maybe you can extend that ability out into the local community, and you can build your identity upward to a more and more inclusive, to more and more inclusive and generalized levels, and find additional responsibility and meaning along the way. And one of the things we're really striving to do with this organization is to try to communicate to people the fact that the alternative to the top-down, centralizing, totalitarian, globalist vision isn't another vision of that sort. It's more the dissemination of the idea that each person has a very important role to play in bringing about a positive future, and the attempt to offer encouragement to people and recognition to them if they're actually doing that. And, I've been very heartened by this as I've toured around the world, because I've been talking about the relationship between responsibility and meaning to my audiences and in my books for quite a long time. And it isn't part of our culture anymore that we don't do a good job of communicating the fact that the meaning that will sustain you in your life, especially through the difficult times, is to be found in the adoption of the fullest responsibility you can manage, and that's simultaneously the adventure of your life, and that if you do take all that on, then there's no reason for you to be a slave to the vision of someone or multiple someones who might want to control your destiny, the destiny that you've abandoned. And so we've brought together people like Lomborg is a very good example, Bjorn Lomborg, who is very good at facing problems forthrightly and determining actual solutions, and pointing out as well that they're well within our capacity to manage. I don't believe that we have to face an apocalyptic future of diminishing expectations. I don't believe the planet has too many people on it. I think that if we got our act together, even more than we have already, that the world could be an abundant place with plenty of opportunity for everyone. I think what we should be working toward is to make everyone as wealthy in the deeper sense as possible, and that if we did that as well, that people would start taking care of the environment on their own, because that's what happens when people have enough money so that they don't have to burn up the present to ensure that the future will exist at all.